The sun was a hammer, and the Nevada desert was the anvil. It beat down on the cracked, thirsty earth with a relentless fury, bleaching the life from everything it touched. The sky was a vast, empty canvas of pale, searing blue, offering no mercy, no hint of a cloud. Heat shimmered up from the ground in glassy waves, distorting the horizon until the distant, jagged mountains seemed to tremble. It was a land that didn't care for survival. It demanded it, and if you couldn't provide, it would break you, parch you, and scour your bones clean with wind and sand. Through this crucible walked a figure so small she seemed an afterthought, a speck of dust on a landscape of dust. Her name was Jessa, though she hadn't heard it spoken with kindness in so long it felt like a borrowed thing. She was 19 years old, but the fear in her eyes was ancient. Her dress, once a pale calico blue, was now the color of the road, ripped at the shoulder where a hand had grabbed it, and frayed at the hem from thorns and rocks. Her feet, wrapped in failing leather shoes, were a geography of blisters and cuts. Each step was a negotiation with pain, a quiet act of war against the impulse to simply lie down and let the sun have its way. She had been running for 2 days, or was it 3? Time had blurred into a single, agonizing cycle of sunup and sundown. She had fled a place that was called a ranch, but was, in truth, a cage gilded with the wealth of a cruel ore magnate named Silas Thorne. She had been brought there not as a wife, but as property, an arrangement made by a distant uncle she barely knew to settle a debt. Her life with Thorne had been one of silent obedience, of learning to make herself small and invisible, of enduring a presence that chilled her more than any desert night. He had not laid a hand on her in violence, not yet, but the threat was a constant presence in his cold, possessive eyes. It was in the way he looked at her as if she were another one of his mineral claims to be worked until she was exhausted and then discarded. The life he had planned for her was a slow, crushing burial, and she had chosen the swift, uncertain death of the desert over it. Her escape had been a frantic, breathless thing, a moment of distraction, a supply wagon leaving its gate unlatched, and a desperate sprint into the sagebrush. She hadn't looked back. She couldn't afford to. The only thing she carried was a small cloth satchel, bumping against her hip with every pained step. It held the entirety of her world, the sum of her past and the sliver of her future. Inside, there were only 3 things. The first was a linen handkerchief, folded into a neat square. It was yellowed with age, the corners soft as a moth's wing. In one corner, a clutch of violets had been embroidered with faded purple thread. It was the only thing she had left of her mother, a woman she remembered only in hazy, sun-drenched fragments. She would take it out at night, when the air was cold and the stars were sharp as chips of ice, and press it to her cheek. It smelled of dust and her own sweat now, but sometimes, if she closed her eyes and tried hard enough, she could almost imagine the scent of lavender and soap, of a life before this one. It was a fragile link to the person she had been, a girl who had once known a gentle touch. The second item was a man's wedding band. It was plain, heavy gold, and it wasn't hers. She'd found it in the back of a dusty drawer in the room Thorne had given her. It had probably belonged to a worker, long gone, who had left it behind. To Jessa, it was a potent and bitter symbol. It was the icon of the life she had just escaped, the cold circle of ownership. She didn't know why she'd taken it, perhaps to remind herself of what she was running from. Sometimes she would clench it in her fist, the metal biting into her palm, and the pain would focus her, sharpening the edges of her resolve when exhaustion threatened to soften them. It was a piece of bondage she carried in order to remember the feeling of being free. The third and most important item was a scrap of brown wrapping paper, torn from a parcel. On it, written in a careful, slanted hand, were 4 words: freedom, go north. The note had been left for her by Maria, the quiet, older woman who cooked at the ranch. Maria had never spoken a word to Jessa about her predicament, but she had seen the hollow look in the girl's eyes. One evening, while clearing the plates, Maria had pressed the folded paper into Jess's hand. Their fingers had brushed for a second. A spark of solidarity in a world of isolation. Maria's eyes had held hers, conveying a whole lifetime of understanding without a single sound. The note was Jess's compass and her prayer. North. It was a direction, a concept, a promise. It was the only thing she had to cling to. Now, under the brutal afternoon sun, that promise was beginning to feel thin. Her canteen had been empty since morning. Her tongue was a dry, swollen thing in her mouth, and a dizzying weakness was creeping into her limbs. The landscape offered no relief. It was all rock and sand and skeletal bushes. Every shadow looked like a man on horseback. Every gust of wind sounded like the thunder of hooves. Thorn was not a man to accept the loss of his property. He would send men. She knew it as surely as she knew the sun would rise again. The fear was a cold knot in her gut, a stark contrast to the fire in her throat. She stumbled, her ankle twisting on a loose rock, and went down hard on one knee. A sharp, searing pain shot up her leg. She cried out, a dry, rasping sound that was immediately swallowed by the vast silence. For a long moment, she stayed there, kneeling on the dusty road, the world tilting around her. It would be so easy to stop, so easy to just lie down and let it be over. The thought was a sweet, dark poison. No. She pushed the thought away, her hand closing instinctively around the satchel. She thought of Maria's eyes. She thought of the cold weight of the ring. She pulled herself up, her legs screaming in protest, and forced herself to keep moving. One foot, then the other, north. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and red, she saw it. At first, she thought it was another trick of the heat, a phantom dancing on the horizon. But as she drew closer, her heart hammering against her ribs, the shape became clearer. It was a thin, gray tendril of smoke, rising straight and steady into the twilight air. Fire! Fire meant people. Her first instinct was a jolt of pure, animal terror. People meant danger. People meant questions. People meant the possibility of being caught and dragged back to Thorn's ranch. She ducked behind a cluster of boulders, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and watched. Her thirst was a roaring beast now, but her fear was stronger. She stayed hidden as the sky deepened to indigo and the first stars appeared. The fire was a small, bright beacon in the growing darkness, a single point of life in the immense emptiness. Who was it? A prospector, a band of travelers, or worse, the men Thorn had sent? She watched for what felt like an eternity, her eyes straining in the gloom. She could make out only one figure moving around the fire, a silhouette, tall and broad. Just one. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, tending to the flames, setting up what looked like a simple camp. He seemed calm, unhurried. He didn't look like he was searching for anyone. A desperate, reckless idea began to form in her mind. He had water. He might have food. Her stomach cramped at the thought. To walk up to a strange man's camp, alone in the middle of nowhere. It was madness. Everything in her screamed against it. Every lesson she had learned in her short, hard life told her to stay hidden, to trust no one, especially not a man. That was their nature. But the alternative was to die of thirst out here in the cold darkness. The desert offered a certain end. The man, the fire, they offered a chance. A slim, dangerous, terrifying chance. She stayed behind the rocks, shivering now as the desert air grew cold. The man settled by his fire, his back to her. He seemed to be cleaning a knife or perhaps preparing food. She couldn't tell. He was a creature of the wilderness, at home in the vast, intimidating silence. He was everything she was afraid of. But the fire he had built was a pool of warmth and light, and she was so very cold and lost in the dark. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she clutched the 3 items in her satchel as if they were talismans that could protect her. The handkerchief for the memory of tenderness, the ring for the memory of why she ran, and the note for the promise of what lay ahead. She thought of its 4 simple words. Freedom. Go north. Her path lay north, and this man's fire was directly on it. Maybe this was a test. Maybe this was the only way through. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself to her feet. Her legs felt like they were made of glass. She took 1 step out from behind the safety of the rocks, then another. The crunch of her shoe on the gravel sounded as loud as a gunshot in the still air. The man by the fire didn't move. He didn't seem to have heard. She continued forward, her eyes locked on his broad back. With every step, she felt as if she were walking a wire stretched over a deep canyon. 1 wrong move, 1 wrong word, and she would fall. She was walking toward a complete stranger, a man named Wade Callahan. Though she didn't know it yet, she was walking toward him with nothing to offer but her desperation, and nothing to lose but a life that had barely been her own. She stopped at the very edge of the fire's reach, where the light was a soft, flickering thing, and the shadows were deep and long behind her. He still hadn't turned. It was possible he knew she was there, had known for the last hour, and was simply waiting to see what the trembling creature at the edge of his camp would do. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. He sat on a worn saddle blanket, 1 leg bent, the other stretched out toward the flames. A rifle, dark and oiled, lay within easy reach, its stock resting on his saddle. He was a man prepared. Her throat felt as if it were lined with sand. She swallowed, a painful, rasping motion that did nothing to help. The words she needed were simple, yet they felt like a monumental weight on her tongue. To speak was to make herself real, to invite scrutiny, to risk everything. Silence was safety. Silence was invisibility. But silence would also be her grave out here. Mr. The word came out as a broken croak, a sound so small and fragile the crackling of the fire nearly consumed it. He didn't startle. His movements were slow, deliberate. He finished wiping the blade of a long knife on a piece of cloth, folded the cloth, and tucked it into a leather pouch on his belt. Only then did he turn his head and look at her. His face was shadows and angles in the firelight. She couldn't make out the color of his eyes, only that they were deep set beneath the brim of a dusty hat. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved from rock, and a day's worth of stubble covered it in a dark shadow. He didn't look kind. He didn't look cruel. He looked like a part of the landscape itself, weathered, enduring, and utterly indifferent. He waited. The silence stretched, and she knew he would not be the one to break it again. He had given her an opening, and it was up to her to step through it or retreat back into the darkness that had almost claimed her. I saw your fire, she stammered, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. My water's gone. Could I just sit for a spell just to get warm? She hated the pleading in her own voice, the way it marked her as weak, as a victim. But there was no hiding it. She was at the end of her rope, and it showed in the slump of her shoulders, the tremor in her hands, the desperation that was a raw, open wound. He looked at her for a long time. His gaze traveled from her face, down the length of her torn dress, to her ruined shoes, and back up again. It was not the kind of look she was used to. It wasn't the leering appraisal of a saloon patron or the cold, proprietary assessment of Silas Thorne. It was a slow, methodical inventory, as if he were judging the condition of a horse that had wandered into his camp. He was measuring her, she realized, measuring her exhaustion, her fear, her potential for trouble. Just when she thought he would tell her to leave, to get lost in the night, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He then turned his attention back to the fire, dismissing her as if the transaction were complete. Relief washed over her so powerfully her knees almost buckled. It was a small gesture, a bare minimum of human decency, but it felt like a royal pardon. She moved carefully, as if approaching a wary animal, and chose a spot on the opposite side of the fire from him. The ground was cold and hard, but the heat from the flames was a living thing, reaching out to her, chasing the deep-set chill from her bones. She sat with her back straight, her knees drawn up to her chest, her small satchel held tightly in her lap. She kept a careful, respectful distance, making herself as small and unthreatening as possible. They shared nothing but the silence. The minutes stretched into an hour. The only sounds were the hiss and pop of the burning mesquite, the sigh of the wind through the sagebrush, and the distant, lonely howl of a coyote. At Thorne's ranch, silence had been a weapon. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket filled with unspoken threats and expectations. This silence was different. It was clean. It was empty. It was the natural quiet of the world, and while it was vast and intimidating, it was not hostile. The man seemed to be a part of it, as comfortable in it as he was in his own skin. He did not fidget or seem to feel the need to fill the space with noise. He simply existed. She watched him from under her lashes, her fear slowly receding, replaced by a cautious curiosity. He took a small, lumpy potato from a sack and began to peel it with the same knife he'd been cleaning earlier. His hands were large and calloused, the knuckles scarred, the nails trimmed short. They were the hands of a man who worked, who fought, who survived. But as the blade moved, she saw an unexpected grace in them. He peeled the potato in a long, unbroken spiral, his movements efficient and precise. There was no wasted motion. She had seen men handle knives before, usually in anger or drunken sport. She had never seen one used with such quiet, domestic purpose. There was a cleanliness to his hands, a scrubbed look to the skin around his nails. That seemed at odds with his rough appearance. It spoke of a discipline, a self-containment that she found both unnerving and strangely reassuring. He dropped the peeled potato into a small cast-iron pot that hung over the fire, then started on another. He worked without looking at her, his focus entirely on his task. She allowed herself to relax a fraction, the warmth of the fire seeping into her, making her aware of just how exhausted she was. Her eyelids grew heavy. The smell of coffee, rich and dark, was also in the air. And soon it was joined by the savory scent of potatoes and perhaps some salted bacon simmering in the pot. The aroma was agonizing. It filled her senses, awakening a hunger so profound it was a physical pain in her belly. She hadn't eaten a real meal in days, surviving on a piece of stale bread she had stolen from the ranch kitchen. She said nothing. To ask for food would be to press her luck, to demand more than the simple charity of a place by his fire. So she stayed quiet, her stomach twisting into knots, and tried to ignore the tantalizing smell. The man finished his preparations. Setting the lid on the pot to let the contents simmer, he poured himself a cup of coffee into a tin mug and drank it slowly, staring into the flames. His face, illuminated by the flickering light, was hard and unreadable. She wondered what he saw in the fire, what thoughts were moving behind those stone-like features. Was he lonely? Was he running from something, too? Or was he just a man who preferred the company of the stars to that of other people? There was no way to know. He was a closed book, written in a language she couldn't understand. After a time, he took a wooden spoon and checked the stew. Seemingly satisfied, he pulled 2 tin plates from his saddlebag, one for himself and one. She held her breath. One for her. He spooned a generous portion of the steaming stew onto each plate. He set his own beside him on the blanket. Then he stood up, walked around the fire, and placed the second plate on a flat rock near where she sat. He did it without a word, without looking at her. He simply set it down and returned to his place. It was an offering, not a handout given with pity, but a simple, factual statement. I have cooked food, and you are here. Therefore, you will eat. Jessa stared at the plate. The steam rose in the cold night air, carrying the scent of bacon and onion and potato. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and sudden. It had been so long since anyone had given her anything without expecting something in return, something she was not willing to give. Her hand trembled as she reached for the plate. It was hot to the touch, as her fingers closed around the warm metal rim. He looked up. It was the first time their eyes truly met. In the full, direct light of the fire, she saw that they were the color of slate, gray and flecked with darker stone. The assessment she had seen in them earlier was still there, but it was not cold. The outline's description had been right. They were like stones rubbing together hard, worn smooth by friction, but not malicious. There was no anger in them, no judgment, no hunger of the kind she had come to dread in men's eyes. There was only a profound stillness, a deep and weary gravity. It was the gaze of a man who had seen too much of the world's ugliness and had decided to withdraw from it. He wasn't looking at her as a woman, or as a beggar, or as a burden. He was looking at her, it seemed, as just another weary creature who had stumbled into his small circle of light. He acknowledged her presence, her pain, and her hunger with that one steady look. Her breath hitched. She pulled the plate into her lap, her eyes dropping from his. She couldn't hold his gaze. It was too direct, too honest. It saw too much. She picked up the fork he had left on the plate and took her first bite. The food was simple, nothing more than potatoes and bacon boiled in water with some salt. But it tasted like a feast. It was hot and savory and real. It was nourishment. It was life. She ate slowly at first, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity, but her ravenous hunger soon took over. She ate until the plate was clean, until every last drop of the broth was gone. She set the empty plate back on the rock and wrapped her arms around her knees, the warmth of the food spreading through her, a comforting weight in her stomach. She felt more human than she had in months. The man finished his own meal, cleaned his plate and utensils with sand and a cloth, and put them away. The silence returned, but it had changed. It was no longer the tense, uncertain quiet between two strangers. A transaction had occurred, the oldest one in the world. A fire had been shared, a meal had been given and received. They had not exchanged names, they had not exchanged stories, but in the vast, unforgiving wilderness, beneath a canopy of cold, distant stars, they had shared a moment of quiet grace, and for Jessa, who had expected nothing but cruelty, it was enough. It was more than enough. The food in her belly was a warm, heavy anchor, holding her to the earth, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The gnawing emptiness that had been her constant companion was gone, replaced by a dull, pleasant ache of fullness. The firelight danced on the tin plate she had placed back on the rock, clean and empty. It seemed a small miracle. She watched the man, Wade, as he methodically cleaned his own gear. He moved with a quiet efficiency that was almost mesmerizing. There was no wasted energy, no hurried motion. Every action was precise, considered, and final. He was a man who inhabited his own space completely, leaving no room for doubt or hesitation. She sat huddled on her side of the fire, a silent observer. The initial terror she had felt upon approaching his camp had receded, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a fragile sense of reprieve. It was like being a ship that had weathered a storm and found a temporary, uncertain harbor. The harbor might have rocks beneath the surface, but for now, the water was calm, and she could afford a moment to breathe. She studied him, trying to piece together the man from the few clues she had: the clean hands, the practical way he prepared a meal, the expensive look of his rifle and saddle. He was not a desperate drifter. There was a substance to him, a self-sufficiency that was as intimidating as it was reassuring. He was not a man who seemed to need anything from anyone. The stars above were brilliant, scattered like diamond dust on black velvet. There was no moon. The vastness of the sky pressed down, a reminder of her own insignificance. Out here, a person could disappear without a trace, their struggles and fears swallowed by the immense, indifferent landscape. The thought should have terrified her, but strangely, it didn't. Tonight, sitting by this small circle of light, she felt not lost, but hidden. For the first time since she'd fled Thorne's ranch, she didn't feel like prey. The man's silent presence was like a wall at her back, a bulwark against the darkness that surrounded them. Then the wind rose. It started as a low whisper, a restless stirring in the distant brush. It carried with it the scent of dust and the cold, clean emptiness of the high desert at night. The fire, which had been burning steadily, flickered and danced, sending a flurry of orange sparks into the darkness. The flames bent and swayed like long grass in a current. Jessa pulled her thin dress tighter around her knees, but it offered little protection. The fabric was flimsy, worn thin by labor and the road, and the wind seemed to pass right through it, touching her skin with icy fingers. The whisper grew into a mournful moan as it swept across the open plain. It was a lonely, desolate sound, the voice of the wilderness itself. It spoke of solitude and survival, of the harsh, unpitying nature of this land. A shiver racked her body, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that had as much to do with the sudden cold as it did with the raw, exposed feeling the sound evoked in her soul. She looked over at the man. He seemed unaffected. He had finished his chores and was now leaning back against his saddle, his hat tipped low over his eyes. He was as still as the rocks behind him, a study in quiet endurance. The wind whipped at the edges of his worn leather vest, but he didn't so much as flinch. He was accustomed to this. The cold, the wind, the loneliness, they were his companions, not his enemies. Jessa hugged her arms to her chest, trying to make herself smaller, to present less of a target to the biting wind. But it was relentless. It found every tear in her dress, every gap in her defenses. The warmth from the meal was fading fast, replaced by a creeping, invasive chill that seemed to be working its way into her very bones. Her teeth began to chatter. She was still sitting a careful distance from him, on the very edge of the fire's effective warmth. To move closer would be an intrusion. It would be a presumption. In her experience, accepting one comfort from a man meant you were expected to be open to others. Proximity was permission. She had learned to keep her distance, to exist in the margins, to never give an inch lest a mile be taken by force. Silas Thorne had taught her that lesson without ever laying a hand on her. His presence had been an invasion in itself, his eyes constantly trespassing on her person, making her feel as though her own skin was not her own. So she stayed where she was, enduring the cold, her body rigid with tension. But the wind was merciless. It gusted again, stronger this time, kicking up a cloud of dust and ash from the fire pit. She squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away. When she opened them, the world seemed to have shrunk to this small, embattled circle of light. The cold was becoming a real pain now, sharp and insistent. Another violent shiver seized her. It was a full-body convulsion, a desperate, involuntary signal from a body that was reaching its limit. She couldn't stop it. And in that moment of weakness, as she trembled in the cold, a crack appeared in the wall of silence she had so carefully maintained. A few words, small and broken, escaped her lips, spoken to no one in particular, perhaps only to the fire itself. They were words she hadn't even known were there, a truth rising from a place so deep inside her she had forgotten it existed. "I've never," she began, her voice a raw, wavering whisper, nearly lost in the wind. She hesitated, the confession tasting strange and dangerous on her tongue. "Felt like I was allowed to be safe." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and terribly real. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the simple, devastating honesty of a child. It was the sum of her life, a thing to be used, a body to be controlled, a soul that was never given sanctuary. Safety was a luxury afforded to other people, to women who belonged to kind fathers or decent husbands. It had never been for her. The man, Wade, did not move for a long moment. She wasn't even sure he had heard her over the wind. She immediately regretted speaking. A hot flush of shame washed over her. Even in the freezing cold, what a stupid thing to say. What a weak, pathetic thing to admit to a stranger. It was an invitation to pity, or worse, to contempt. But then he moved. He didn't speak. He didn't even look at her. He simply pushed his hat back on his head, rose to his feet in one fluid motion, and walked over to his bedroll. It was a thick, heavy bundle of canvas and wool. He untied the leather straps and pulled out a heavy sheepskin-lined coat. It was a formidable garment, made of thick canvas, worn and faded from the sun, with a collar of thick, creamy wool. He held it for a second, then walked around the fire toward her. Jessa flinched, instinctively pulling away, her heart beginning to pound a frantic, frightened rhythm against her ribs. This was it. The price. He was going to sit next to her, put his arm around her, claim his payment for the meal and the fire. But he didn't. He stopped just behind her, still without a word. And then, gently, he draped the heavy coat over her shoulders. The weight of it was the first thing she noticed. It was substantial, a solid, reassuring presence. It settled over her like a shield. Then came the warmth. It was immediate, a blessed relief from the biting wind. The thick wool lining was soft against her neck, and the canvas shell blocked the wind completely. She was enveloped in a cocoon of sudden, surprising warmth. He let go and stepped back, returning to his spot by the saddle as if nothing had happened. He sat down, pulled his hat low again, and resumed his silent vigil, staring into the fire. The entire transaction had taken less than a minute and had been conducted in complete silence. Jessa sat frozen, clutching the edges of the coat. It was huge on her. The sleeves hung down past her hands, and the hem brushed the ground around her. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and the clean, dusty scent of the man himself. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was simple and honest. It was the smell of the wild, open spaces he seemed so at home in. She pulled the coat tighter around herself, burying her face in the soft wool of the collar. It was so warm, a deep, profound warmth that went beyond the physical. It felt like safety. The very thing she had just confessed she had never been allowed. It was a kindness so unexpected, so unadorned, that it completely disarmed her. There had been no preamble, no negotiation. He had seen a need and had met it, simply and directly. There was no hint of charity in the act, no condescension. It had been as practical and impersonal as him adding another log to the fire. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they were different. They weren't tears of desperation or fear. They were born of a strange, aching gratitude that was so intense it was almost painful. She let them fall, tracing hot paths down her cold cheeks. She kept her face hidden in the collar of the coat, not wanting him to see. She sat like that for a long time, soaking in the warmth, listening to the wind howl harmlessly outside her new shelter. The firelight flickered. The man was a silent shape across the flames, and the world was held at bay. In the quiet of her mind, a new thought began to take shape, a realization that was as startling as the coat itself. Every act of kindness in her life had been a transaction. A piece of bread was given in exchange for a day's hard labor. A roof over her head was provided in exchange for her submission. Even a smile from a man was often a prelude to an unwanted advance. Everything had a price. But this was different. The realization was so clear, so stark, that she felt compelled to give it voice, just as she had with her fear. She lifted her head slightly, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames, the coat a heavy, comforting weight on her shoulders. "This is the first time," she whispered, her voice stronger now, clearer. "This is the first time someone's given me something without asking for anything back." The words settled in the space between them, across the fire. Wade's posture didn't change. He remained a still, shadowed figure, but she saw his hand move. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small cloth pouch of tobacco and a slip of paper. With those graceful, efficient hands, He began to roll a cigarette. It was a common, grounding ritual. She watched his fingers expertly crease the paper, sprinkle the tobacco, and roll it into a tight, neat cylinder. He brought the cigarette to his lips. She expected to see him lean forward, to take a burning twig from the fire to light it. He didn't. He just held it there, between his lips, unlit. He took a slow breath in and then blew it out, a stream of empty air. It was a ghost of a gesture, in the firelight. She saw his jaw tighten, just for a second, a subtle clenching of the muscle beneath the stubble. He hadn't looked at her. He hadn't said a word, but he had heard, and in that small, tense motion, she knew he had understood. The warmth of the sheepskin coat was a heavy, comforting dream. For the first time in a long while, Jessa felt the tense, vigilant knot in her shoulders begin to loosen. Her eyelids were heavy, the dance of the fire's embers a lulling, hypnotic rhythm. The wind had settled into a steady, sighing whisper, and the deep, profound silence of the desert night had returned, a blanket of peace. She was still awake, but hovering in that soft, hazy space just before sleep, a place she had not allowed herself to visit for many nights. The man, Wade, was a motionless silhouette against the dying glow of the fire, a silent guardian in her waking dream. In this small, fragile bubble of warmth and stillness, the world and its dangers felt 1,000 miles away. It began not as a sound, but as a feeling, a low, rhythmic vibration in the soles of her worn shoes, a tremor that traveled from the hard-packed earth into her bones. At first, she thought it was her own heart, the tired beat of it against her ribs, but the feeling was too deep, too steady. It was the pulse of the earth itself, a distant, gathering cadence. She lifted her head from the woolly collar of the coat, her newfound drowsiness evaporating like mist in the sun. She listened, holding her breath, her senses straining against the vast quiet. And then she heard it, faint at the very edge of hearing, but unmistakable. Hoofbeats. Not the slow, plodding walk of a lone traveler, but the urgent, drumming rhythm of several horses being ridden hard. They were coming fast. Ice flooded her veins. Every muscle in her body went rigid. It was a primal, instinctual reaction, a terror so deep and familiar it was a part of her. The peaceful desert night shattered into a million sharp-edged pieces. The sanctuary was gone. The hunters had found her trail. Her breath came in a short, sharp gasp. The man across the fire moved, his head lifting in a single, sharp motion. He had heard it too, in the dim red glow of the embers. She saw him shift, his body coiling with a sudden, lethal tension. The weary, quiet man was gone, replaced by something else entirely, something dangerous and alert. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Jessa. Her mind went white with it. There was no thought, only a frantic, animal need to flee, to hide, to become invisible. She scrambled backward on her hands and heels, the heavy coat tangling around her legs, feeling less like a shield and more like a net. Her hand flew to the small cloth satchel at her side, her fingers closing around it in a death grip. It was all she had, her past, her hope, her single, fragile claim to her own life. She pushed herself into the deep shadows beyond the firelight, trying to melt into the darkness, to disappear. Wade was on his feet. He hadn't made a sound, but he was standing, a tall, dark shape between her and the oncoming sound. The rifle he'd had resting on his saddle was now in his hands, held with a familiarity that spoke of long and intimate use. He didn't look back at her. His attention was fixed on the darkness to the south, the direction from which the sound was growing, swelling from a distant drumbeat into a low, menacing thunder. The firelight caught the barrels of the rifle, a dull gleam of oiled steel. "Who are they?" His voice was low and flat, stripped of all emotion. It was not a question born of curiosity, but a demand for tactical information. There was no time for fear. There was only time for facts. Jessa pressed herself against a cold, rough boulder, her whole body shaking. The sound of the horses was louder now, a frantic, galloping rhythm that was the soundtrack to all her nightmares. They were close, so close. She could almost feel the ground shaking with their approach. She tried to speak, to force a name past the terror that had seized her throat, but only a choked, pathetic whimper escaped. "The girl," Wade said, his voice still level, but with a new, hard edge to it. "Who is riding for you?" The directness of the question cut through a layer of her panic. He needed to know. Her life, and now his, depended on it. She squeezed her eyes shut, and a face swam into her vision, a man with a cruel, thin mouth and pale, cold eyes. The face of Silas Thorne's foreman, the man who watched her with a mixture of contempt and ownership. "Hatcher!" she finally choked out, the name a ragged tear in the fabric of the night. Abel Hatcher. The name seemed to mean something to him. She saw the slightest stiffening in his shoulders, a flicker of recognition. He didn't waste another second. He turned, and in 2 long strides, he was beside her. His hand clamped down on her upper arm, his grip hard and strong, pulling her to her feet. "No time," he said, his voice a low growl. He gave her a little shake, forcing her eyes to meet his. In the gloom, his face was a mask of grim resolve, his eyes glinting like chips of steel. "Don't scream, don't fight, you ride with me, understand?" She could only nod, her teeth chattering too hard to form words. There was no blame in his eyes, no accusation for bringing this trouble down on him. There was only an intense, focused urgency that left no room for anything else. He was a man facing a storm, and his only concern was how to ride it out. What happened next was a blur of frantic, efficient motion. He was already moving, pulling her along with him toward a dark shape that was his horse, a big, powerful-looking gelding that had been tethered to a scrub oak. The animal was already alert, its ears pricked, its head up, sensing the approaching danger. With one hand, Wade ripped the tether free. With the other, he grabbed his saddlebags and a canteen, slinging them over the horse's back with a single, fluid motion. He scooped up his saddle blanket and kicked a wave of dirt and sand over the fire's embers, extinguishing the betraying glow in a hiss of smoke and steam. The camp was gone. In less than 30 seconds, it was as if they had never been there. The hoofbeats were deafening now. They were just beyond the rise, a wave of violence about to crest and break over them. A man's voice shouted in the distance, a harsh, ugly sound that made Jessa's blood run cold. Wade swung himself up into the saddle. He reached down, and without a word, he grabbed Jessa by the front of the heavy coat and hauled her up behind him. It was not a gentle or romantic gesture. It was a matter of pure, physical necessity. She landed awkwardly, her legs scrambling for purchase, her arms flailing before she instinctively wrapped them around his waist. "Hold on," he grunted, and then he dug his heels into the horse's flanks. The world exploded into motion. The big horse leaped forward, launching them from a standstill into a full, desperate gallop. The force of the acceleration threw Jessa hard against Wade's back. The air was knocked from her lungs in a sharp gasp. She buried her face against the rough fabric of his vest, her fingers digging into his sides, her only anchor in a world that had suddenly turned into a violent, chaotic blur. They plunged into the darkness, leaving the faint scent of their extinguished fire behind. The moon had risen, a cold, silver disk in the inky sky, and it bathed the landscape in a stark, ghostly light. The desert was transformed into a world of sharp contrasts, of brilliant silver and deep, menacing shadows. Sagebrush whipped past them, their thorny branches tearing at Jessa's dress and legs. The ground was a treacherous, uneven carpet of rocks and sand, but Wade guided the horse with an unnerving skill, his body moving in perfect sync with the powerful animal beneath them. He was not just riding the horse, he seemed to be a part of it, a single creature of muscle and will fleeing across the moon-bleached plains. The shouts behind them grew louder, angrier. Hatcher and his men had found the camp. Jessa squeezed her eyes shut, but she couldn't block out the sound of their pursuit, the thunder of 8 or 10 hooves pounding the earth, a relentless, terrifying rhythm that was gaining on them. She pressed herself tighter against Wade's back, trying to make herself smaller. His body was a wall of solid muscle and bone. She could feel the tension in him, the coiled strength in his back and shoulders. He was completely focused, his entire being concentrated on the act of escape. The wind screamed past her ears, whipping her hair into a frenzy, stealing her breath. The violent, jarring motion of the horse was a constant punishment, but she held on, her knuckles white, her mind a numb haze of terror. They raced across a wide, flat expanse of alkali dust, the horse's hooves throwing up pale, ghostly clouds behind them. Then they were into a broken country of ravines and rocky outcrops. Wade didn't slow. He navigated the treacherous terrain as if he could see in the dark, urging the horse down a steep, gravelly wash and up the other side, the animal's powerful legs scrambling for purchase. It was in the heart of this chaos, with the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them and the cold wind tearing at her, that a strange and profound shift began to happen inside Jessa. The terror was still there, a cold, hard stone in her gut. But something else was rising to meet it. It was the solid, unyielding reality of the man in front of her. His back was a shield against the wind. His strength was a bulwark against the violence of the ride. He hadn't offered her words of comfort or promises of safety. He had offered her something far more real action. He had put himself between her and the men who were hunting her. She had spent her life feeling trapped inside her own body, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Fear was a prison, and she had been its solitary inmate for as long as she could remember. But now, pressed against this man's back, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his breathing, the sheer physical fact of his presence, the nature of that cage began to change. Her heart was still hammering, but it was no longer the frantic, helpless beat of a trapped animal. It was a war drum, pounding in time with the horse's galloping hooves. The wind that screamed past was not trying to tear her apart. It was the sound of speed, of flight, of freedom, and the arms she had wrapped around his waist were not the gesture of a desperate, clinging victim. They were anchoring her to her own survival. She risked a glance over her shoulder. In the moonlight, she could see them. 3 dark figures on horseback. Closing the distance, one of them raised a rifle, and a flash of orange light split the darkness, followed a second later by the sharp crack of a gunshot. The bullet whined past, terrifyingly close. Jessa flinched, burying her face back into the solid warmth of Wade's back. She expected him to curse, to show some sign of fear. He did nothing. He just leaned lower over the horse's neck, urging it to an even more reckless speed. He was a rock in a raging river, unmovable, unbreakable, and she was holding on to him, for the first time in her life. She felt not like a prisoner in a cage, but like a soldier in a fortress. Her own chest, her own beating heart, was no longer a symbol of her vulnerability. Shielded by him, it was the keep, the strong tower at the center of the battle. She was still terrified, but for the first time, her terror was not a solitary burden. It was a shared crisis. She was no longer just Jessa, the runaway. She was one half of us who were fleeing, us who were fighting to survive, and in that simple, unspoken partnership, forged in the heat of a desperate chase, she felt a flicker of something she had never known before: strength. The ride was a long, punishing blur of darkness and moonlight, a desperate, lung-searing flight that seemed to have no end. Jessa clung to Wade, her world reduced to the solid wall of his back, the thunder of the horse's hooves, and the screaming of the wind. They did not stop, did not slow, pushing the great horse to the very limits of its endurance. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them, swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape, but the fear remained, a cold, metallic taste in her mouth. Dawn found them in a different country. The flat, open desert had given way to a broken, rolling land of low, sun-baked hills and deep, shadowy canyons. The air was cooler here, the light a soft, pearly gray that promised another day of searing heat. The horse was stumbling now, its powerful sides heaving, its coat dark and slick with sweat. Its breath came in great, ragged gasps. Wade finally slowed the animal to a walk, his hand resting on its lathered neck, murmuring low, soothing words that Jessa couldn't quite hear. He guided them into the mouth of a narrow, winding canyon where the walls rose high on either side, shielding them from view. Here, he dismounted. His movements were stiff, the movements of a man who had been rigid in the saddle for hours. He helped Jessa down. Her legs were numb and useless, and she nearly collapsed, her body a single, throbbing ache. He steadied her with a hand on her arm, his touch impersonal and brief, before turning his full attention to the horse. He walked the animal, cooling it down, his hands running over its legs, checking for injuries. His care for the horse was absolute, a testament to the bond between a man and the creature that had just carried them to safety. Jessa leaned against the cool rock of the canyon wall, the heavy sheepskin coat a dead weight on her shoulders. Now that the immediate danger had passed, a soul-crushing exhaustion washed over her. She watched Wade work, a silent, efficient figure in the gray morning light. He was a man of action, not words. He hadn't asked her a single question about Hatcher or why they were chasing her. He had simply accepted the fact of the danger and acted. The simplicity of it was staggering. After tending to the horse, he came over to her. He handed her a canteen. "Drink," he said. It was not a request. Slowly. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She did as he said, taking small, slow sips, letting the liquid soothe her parched throat. He watched her for a moment, his slate-gray eyes unreadable. "We can't stay here," he said, taking the canteen back. "They'll track the horse. We walk from here." He unstrapped his saddlebags and rifle from the exhausted animal. Then he did something that surprised her. He gave the horse a firm slap on the rump, sending it trotting off down the canyon, away from them. "Go on now," he murmured. A free horse left fewer tracks to follow than a tethered one. He shouldered the rifle and the saddlebags, which looked heavy. "This way." He started walking, not looking back to see if she was following. He expected her to. He expected her to keep up. The next hour was a new kind of misery. Her feet, already blistered, were now on fire. Every step was a fresh agony. But she followed him without complaint, a small, limping shadow in his wake. He led them up out of the canyon and through a maze of rock formations that would have been impossible for horses to navigate. He was deliberately obscuring their trail, making their path as difficult and confusing as possible. Finally, as the sun climbed higher, casting sharp, dark shadows across the land, he stopped. They stood on a ridge overlooking a shallow, wide valley. And there, nestled in the valley floor, was the ghost of a town. It wasn't much, a dozen or so buildings, weathered to a uniform silver gray, stood in various states of collapse. A wide, dusty main street, empty of life, ran through the middle. One building, larger than the rest, had a faded sign that might have once said, "Saloon." Another was clearly a blacksmith's shop, its great stone forge slowly crumbling. There was no movement, no sound but the sigh of the wind whistling through the empty window frames. It was a place where dreams had come to die, a skeleton picked clean by time and the harsh elements. Wade led her down a steep, rocky path toward the town, but he didn't head for the main street. He skirted the edge, keeping to the shadows of the decaying buildings, his eyes constantly scanning. Listening? He led her to the very last house on the edge of the settlement, set slightly apart from the others, its back to a low, crumbling butte. It was a small, simple cabin, built of rough-hewn logs, now gray and splintered. The roof sagged in the middle, and the single window was a dark, vacant eye, its glass long gone. A porch ran along the front, its boards warped and broken in places. It looked as dead as the rest of the town. Wade stopped at the door, which hung crookedly from a single leather hinge. He put his hand on the weathered wood, and for a long moment, he just stood there. A strange stillness came over him. Jessa, standing a few feet behind him, saw his shoulders slump almost imperceptibly. It was the first sign of weariness she had seen from him. His gaze drifted over the doorframe, a flicker of some deep, hidden emotion in his eyes. He wasn't just looking at a derelict cabin. He was looking at a memory. He pushed the door open. It protested with a long, groaning screech that was painfully loud in the oppressive silence. He stepped inside, and after a moment's hesitation, Jessa followed him. The inside was one small room, thick with the smell of dust, dry rot, and old, cold ashes. A thick blanket of dust covered everything, softening the sharp edges of the room's decay. Sunlight streamed through the empty window and the gaps in the roof, cutting the gloom with bright, hazy shafts in which dust motes danced like tiny, restless spirits. There was a stone fireplace against one wall, its hearth filled with charred wood and soot. A crude wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. One of the chairs had collapsed, its legs splayed out at an awkward angle. In one corner, a simple bed frame, its rope supports long since rotted away, was slowly being consumed by dust. It was a place of profound and absolute abandonment. But as Wade stepped further into the room, Jessa saw it through his eyes. This wasn't just an empty shell. It was a home, his home. He walked over to the fireplace and ran his hand along the rough stone of the mantelpiece, his fingers leaving clean trails in the thick dust. He stared at the wall beside the fireplace, his expression hardening. Jessa's eyes followed his gaze, and then she saw it. It was a dark, reddish-brown stain on the rough plaster of the wall. About chest high, it was old, faded, the color of rust. It wasn't large, but it was stark and ugly against the pale wall. It was a silent, permanent scream. The shape of it was irregular, a splatter that told a story of sudden, shocking violence. It was dried blood, a ghost of a wound left on the house itself. Jessa felt a cold knot form in her stomach. This quiet, desolate place had not been peaceful in its end. Something terrible had happened here. Wade turned away from the wall, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes were haunted. He looked around the small, ruined room, and Jessa could almost feel the weight of his memories pressing in on them. He had lived here. He had built the fires in that hearth, sat at that table. The ghost on the wall was his ghost. He had lived here with his brother. She suddenly knew, though she couldn't have said how. The thought was just there, a certainty. The 2 chairs, the smallness of the space. It was a place built for 2, and now there was only 1. He seemed to shake himself from his reverie, his focus returning to the present, to her. He set the saddlebags on the dusty table and began to unpack them with his usual methodical calm. He took out a small sack of dried jerky, a tin of coffee, and a clean, folded piece of linen. "We'll be safe here for a while," he said, his voice rough. "They won't think to look in a place like this." Jessa just nodded, still looking at the stain on the wall. She wrapped her arms around herself, the heavy coat suddenly feeling inadequate. The chill she felt had nothing to do with the temperature. Wade's gaze fell on her face. "You're hurt." She hadn't even realized it. She put a hand to her cheek and her fingers came away sticky. During the wild ride through the brush, a branch must have whipped across her face. It was a small thing, a minor scratch compared to the exhaustion and the terror, and she hadn't felt it until now. A thin line of blood had trickled down her cheek and dried there. He picked up the clean linen cloth and his canteen. He unscrewed the cap and poured a small amount of the precious water onto a corner of the cloth, his movements economical and precise. He walked toward her. Jessa's first instinct was to back away. The room suddenly felt very small. the memory of violence on the wall very fresh. He was a stranger, a man of immense physical strength and a capacity for swift, decisive action. And he was coming toward her. Her body tensed, her mind screaming all the old warnings. Keep your distance. Don't let him touch you. He stopped in front of her. He didn't say anything. He simply lifted his hand, the one holding the damp cloth. He paused, giving her a chance to retreat, to refuse. His slate-gray eyes were steady on hers, and in their depths, she saw not threat, but a quiet, weary sadness. She didn't move. She stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath caught in her throat. She was caught between a lifetime of fear and a flicker of something new, something she couldn't name. His hand came closer. His fingers, large and calloused from work and weather, were surprisingly steady as they touched her chin, tilting her face gently toward the light from the window. His touch was feather-light, barely there at all, yet it sent a jolt through her entire body. And then, with the utmost care, he began to clean the scratch on her cheek. His movements were incredibly gentle. He dabbed at the dried blood with the wet cloth, his touch as delicate as a moth's wing. It was a gesture of such profound and unexpected tenderness that it shattered Jess's defenses. This was the same man who had hauled her onto his horse like a sack of grain, who had ridden through the night with a hard, unyielding focus. These were the same hands that held a rifle with lethal familiarity. Yet now, they were ministering to a small, insignificant scratch with the care a man might use to handle a fragile bird. It was a touch that seemed to know what it was to hurt, and how to heal. It was a touch, she thought with a sudden, startling clarity, as if he had once known love. She stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. She could feel the warmth of his fingers through the cloth, the slight roughness of his skin against hers. She could see the fine lines around his eyes, the dark stubble on his jaw, the way his lips were pressed together in concentration. He was so close. The air between them was thick with unspoken things, with the ghosts of the room and the raw, shared experience of their flight. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her dusty cheek. It was not a tear of fear or sadness, but of a strange, overwhelming release. It was as if the simple, humane gesture of his touch had unlocked something inside her, a dam of pain and loneliness she had kept walled up for years. He finished, his thumb brushing away the tear track with the same gentle pressure. He looked at the small smear of blood on the white cloth, his expression unreadable. Then he let his hand fall, stepping back, putting a respectful distance between them once more. The connection was broken. Jessa stood there, her cheek clean and cool where he had touched it. The spot tingled, a lingering warmth that spread through her entire body. She kept her arms wrapped around herself, but it was no longer a defensive posture. It was an embrace. She was trying to hold on to the feeling, to the astonishing, terrifying, and wonderful sensation of being cared for. She had tried so hard to keep her distance, to keep the walls around her heart high and strong. But in the dusty silence of this haunted room, with a single, gentle touch, he had found a crack, and a little bit of light was beginning to get in. The moment hung in the dusty air, stretched thin and taut between them. He had taken a step back, severing the fragile connection his touch had created. The space he put between them felt like a chasm, a return to the cold reality of their situation, two strangers, bound by circumstance, hiding in the ghost of a dead man's past. The tenderness was gone, replaced by his familiar, impenetrable stillness. He had withdrawn into himself, the walls of his fortress sliding back into place, leaving her outside in the cold once more. He turned away from her, his broad back a final, dismissive statement. His attention shifted to the room itself, his gaze sweeping over the dusty floor, the broken chair, the crooked door. It was a practical assessment, the look of a man identifying tasks, calculating risks, solving problems. He was already moving on, leaving the moment of vulnerability behind as if it had never happened. He took a step toward the door, his purpose clear to secure their shelter, to return to the world of tangible threats and necessary actions, a world where he was in control, where feelings were a dangerous and unnecessary luxury. Something inside Jessa broke. It was a sharp, clean snap, like a dry twig under a heavy boot. All her life, she had watched people turn their backs on her. She had been left, abandoned, dismissed, and overlooked. She had learned to accept it, to swallow the hurt and make herself smaller, to retreat into the silent, invisible corners of the world. But not this time, not him. The simple, profound kindness he had shown her had planted a seed in the barren soil of her soul, and she could not, would not, let him walk away and allow it to wither. This moment was too important. It was the first truly human connection she had felt in years, and she would not let it dissolve into dust and memory. Before her conscious mind could raise its 1,000 objections, before the chorus of old fears could scream their warnings, her hand shot out, her fingers, trembling, closed around the hard muscle of his forearm. The fabric of his shirt was coarse beneath her touch. He froze. It was not a gradual stop, but a complete and total cessation of movement, as if he had been turned to stone. Every line of his body went rigid. He did not turn to look at her, but she could feel the shock that went through him, a current that seemed to travel up his arm and into her own hand. He stood with his back to her, a statue of arrested motion. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the dust motes seemed to hang suspended in the shafts of light. Jessa's heart was a wild, frantic drum against her ribs. She should let go. She should apologize, murmur an excuse, and retreat. It was what she had always done. But her fingers, as if with a will of their own, tightened their grip. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, a thread of sound so thin she feared it would break. "I've never trusted anyone." The words were out, exposed and shivering in the quiet room. She had never spoken them aloud, had never even dared to form them so clearly in her own mind. It was a truth so fundamental to her existence that it was like the color of her own eyes, always there, but never examined. Trust was a fool's game, a currency for a world she had never been a part of. She had learned from her first memories that the hands of men were for taking, their words were for deceiving, and their kindness was a lure for a hidden hook. He still didn't move, but she felt the muscle in his arm tense beneath her fingers. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to continue, to say it all. "Not a soul, not since I was a child. What you've done, staying with me, sharing your food, the chase. This," she said, her voice cracking with the weight of the admission, "is a first." Slowly, as if it took a great and painful effort, he turned his head. He didn't turn his body, just his head, looking at her over his shoulder. His slate-gray eyes were dark, shadowed by the brim of his hat and his own inner turmoil. He looked at her fingers on his arm. Then his gaze traveled up to her face. He saw the tears glistening on her lashes, the raw vulnerability in her expression. He saw the desperate, terrified courage it had taken for her to speak those words. The stony mask he wore so well cracked. A flicker of something ancient and painful moved in the depths of his eyes. He understood the value of the gift she was offering him. Trust, from a person like her, was a jewel of unimaginable worth, unearthed from a place of profound darkness. His own voice was a low, rough rasp, as if it had been scraped over rocks. "I lost my own faith," he said, the words seeming to be pulled from him, unwillingly, a long time ago. It was a confession, an answer to her own. He wasn't just talking about trust in people. He was talking about something deeper, faith in goodness, in justice, in the possibility of a life that wasn't defined by violence and loss. The stain on the wall pulsed in Jessa's vision, a dark amen to his words. His loss had happened here, in this room. The ghost of it was still present, a cold spot in the air. The shared admission, the twin confessions of two broken souls, created a new, powerful connection between them. It was a bridge built not of hope, but of a shared, acknowledged despair. Jessa felt a surge of empathy so strong it made her dizzy. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. How could she be in that moment? He was not an intimidating stranger, but a fellow survivor. A man carrying a wound as deep, if not deeper, than her own. Her hand slid from his forearm down to his wrist. She wanted to offer comfort, a simple human touch to acknowledge his pain. As her fingers wrapped around the hard bones and sinew of his wrist, she felt it. A tremor. It was very slight, almost imperceptible. A fine, faint vibration in the muscle and tendon beneath his skin. It was the only outward sign of the powerful emotion he was holding in check. A crack in his formidable control. The discovery of it sent a shock through her. This man, this pillar of quiet strength and unshakable competence, was trembling. Her touch, her words, had reached through his armor and touched something raw and unguarded within him. The knowledge was a terrifying and powerful thing. It meant she was not the only vulnerable one in this room. The sight of his weakness did not make her feel strong. It made her feel brave. She looked directly into his eyes, holding his gaze, refusing to let him look away, to retreat again into his solitude. "Then let tonight be the first," she whispered, her voice gaining a strange, quiet strength. She leaned in a fraction of an inch, her world narrowing to the space between their faces, the shared air they were breathing. For both of us, the first time we try to believe again. It was an invitation, a challenge, and a prayer, all in one. She was offering him a pact, a mutual agreement to take a single, terrifying step out of the darkness of their pasts. It was a reckless, impossible offer, made in a dusty, derelict room haunted by death, but she meant it with every fiber of her being. For a long, silent eternity, he just looked at her. His eyes searched her face, looking for lies, for manipulation, for the hidden angles she must be playing. He found none. He found only a raw, desperate sincerity that mirrored the emptiness in his own soul. He saw that she was not offering him a cure, but simply a hand to hold in the dark. The tremor in his wrist subsided. A long, slow breath escaped his lips. The tension in his shoulders seemed to bleed away, leaving him looking impossibly weary and impossibly sad. Then, with a slowness that felt ceremonial, he raised his other hand, the one that was free. He lifted it not to her cheek, but to her hair. She held her breath as his large, calloused fingers gently brushed against the side of her head. His touch was hesitant at first, as if he were handling something priceless and fragile, something he feared he might break. He was a man unaccustomed to gentleness, and the effort it took him was a testament to the importance of the moment. His fingers threaded into her messy, tangled hair, which had been whipped into chaos by their long ride. He did not caress her. It was not a lover's touch. It was something else, something more profound. With a deliberate, almost reverent motion, he gathered the strands of her hair and gently, so gently, pulled them back from her face, away from her neck, as if he were clearing away the last of the shadows that obscured her. It felt like a ritual, an anointing. It was an act of seeing, of acknowledging her, all of her. Not just the frightened girl, but the brave woman who had just offered him a piece of her own bruised and battered hope. The gesture exposed the slender, vulnerable line of her throat. She did not flinch. She tilted her head back slightly, an unconscious act of submission that was, in reality, the ultimate act of trust. She was giving him access to her most defenseless place, a silent declaration that she did not believe he would harm her. He held her there, his hand cupping the back of her head, his thumb resting lightly on the nape of her neck. He looked down at her, and the stony, guarded expression in his eyes was gone. In its place was something new, something she had never seen before. It was an intense, focused light, a warmth that seemed to emanate from the very core of him. It was not the wild, consuming blaze of passion, nor the comforting, steady glow of affection. It was a small, contained fire, flickering to life in a place that had been cold and dark for a very long time. A fire in the palm of his hand, fragile and precious. It was the beginning of something. A spark of faith that was both beautiful and dangerous, and it had the power to either light their way forward or to burn them both to ashes. And in the silent, dusty ruin of his past, he held her in that gaze, and for the first time did not seem to be afraid of the light. He did not release her immediately. For a long, breathless moment, he held her there in the dusty shaft of morning light, his hand a warm, solid weight cupping the back of her head, his eyes holding hers with that new, flickering fire. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the silent, haunted room. It was a moment of perfect, terrifying stillness, a fragile truce with the ghosts of both their pasts. Then, as gently as he had touched her, he let go. His hand fell away, and the spell was broken. He stepped back, turning from her to face the room, and the quiet, dangerous man she had first met was back, at least on the surface. But something fundamental had shifted between them. The air was no longer thick with suspicion and fear, but with a fragile, unspoken understanding. A pact had been made, not in words, but in a shared glance, a trembling hand, a moment of profound and mutual vulnerability. Jessa slept that day, a deep and dreamless sleep of pure exhaustion. She didn't mean to. She had simply sat on the floor, leaning her back against the wall. His heavy coat still wrapped around her like a protective shell, and the weight of the past days had pulled her under. She slept through the heat of the afternoon, through the slow, silent passage of hours, a sleep more profound and restorative than any she had known. For the first time, she slept without fear of what the morning would bring, because morning had already come and gone, and he was still there. When she woke, the light in the room was the soft, golden red of late afternoon. The harsh angles of the decaying cabin were softened, the dust motes glowing like embers in the slanted rays of the setting sun. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure of where she was. Then it all came back: the chase, the ghost town, the confession, his touch. Wade was not in the room. A flicker of the old, familiar panic seized her. He had left. He had taken his things and abandoned her in this ruin. She sat bolt upright, her heart starting its frantic, frightened rhythm. But then her eyes fell on the table. His rifle was there, leaning against it. His saddlebags were on the floor beside it. He had not left. A wave of relief so powerful it left her weak washed over her. He had not left. A new sound reached her ears, a steady, rhythmic scraping from outside. She got to her feet, his coat falling from her shoulders, and walked cautiously to the empty window frame. She peered out. Wade was in the small, dusty yard behind the cabin. He had found a fallen log and, using the large, heavy knife from his belt, was meticulously shaving off long, thin strips of wood. He worked with a patient, focused intensity, his movements economical and precise. He was making kindling. She watched him for a long time. This quiet, self-contained man. He was a creature of purpose, his entire being geared toward the practical necessities of survival. Yet she had seen the cracks in his armor. She had felt him tremble. She knew now that his silence was not one of indifference, but one of profound, deeply buried pain. He was a man who had built a fortress around his heart, and she, somehow, had been allowed a brief glimpse inside the walls. As dusk settled, he came back inside, his arms loaded with the kindling and some larger pieces of wood he must have scavenged from a nearby collapsed structure. He didn't say a word to her, but he gave her a brief nod of acknowledgement. He knelt at the hearth and, with the skill of a man who had done it 1,000 times, he built a fire. He laid the kindling, struck a spark from his flint and steel, and gently blew the fledgling spark into a small, steady flame. Soon, a cheerful, crackling fire was pushing back the growing gloom and the chill of the evening air. They ate a simple meal of jerky and the last of his hardtack biscuits, washed down with water. They ate in their now customary silence. But it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer the tense, wary quiet of two strangers. It was a comfortable silence, a shared space that no longer needed to be filled with words. The firelight cast warm, dancing shadows on the walls, and, for the first time, the dark stain beside the fireplace seemed less like a wound and more like a faded, distant scar. The next morning, a new rhythm began. It was unspoken, unnegotiated, an instinctive dance of two people creating a space together. When Jessa awoke, Wade was already gone, but his rifle and bags remained. She knew he was out scouting, checking their back trail, ensuring their sanctuary remained undiscovered. The trust this implied leaving his possessions. Leaving her was a quiet, powerful statement. Instead of waiting in fear, Jessa felt a strange, new sense of purpose. This was their refuge, their home, however temporary. She would not let it remain a dusty, sorrowful ruin. She found a tattered, worn-out broom in a corner, its bristles thin and uneven, and she began to sweep. It was a monumental task. A thick carpet of dust, dirt, and debris covered the floor. As she worked, great clouds of it rose into the air, choking her, but she didn't stop. She swept with a determined fury, a physical act of pushing back against the years of neglect and sorrow that clung to the small cabin. She was not just sweeping away dust, she was sweeping away the ghosts, making a space for something new to breathe. She found an old wooden bucket and took it to a small, trickling stream Wade had shown her, a thin ribbon of life hidden in a crease of the hills behind the town. She hauled buckets of water back and, with a rag torn from the hem of her already ruined dress, she began to clean. She washed the thick grime from the tabletop. She scrubbed at the soot on the stones of the hearth. She even washed the empty window frame, wiping away the cobwebs and dirt until the morning light could stream in, clean and unobstructed. The work was hard. Her muscles ached and her hands were raw. But it was good work. It was work with a purpose that was her own. She was not cleaning for a master, under the threat of punishment. She was cleaning for herself, for them. She was building a nest, a small, defiant pocket of order and life in the midst of desolation. When Wade returned in the middle of the day, he stopped in the doorway, and she saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes. The room was transformed. The floor was clean, the tables scrubbed, and the air, while still smelling of old wood, was fresh. He didn't say anything, but his gaze lingered on the clean table, the swept floor. He saw what she had done. He, in turn, set about his own work. The cabin's door hung crookedly, a gaping invitation to the wind and the cold. Wade spent the rest of the day repairing it. He had found a solid, weathered plank from a collapsed outbuilding, and he painstakingly began to shape it with his knife. The sound of his work filled the afternoon, a steady, reassuring rhythm, the scrape of the blade against wood, the solid thud as he knocked a piece into place. It was the sound of a home being mended. It was the sound of protection. While he worked, Jessa explored their small domain. She followed the little stream as it wound its way through a thicket of willows, and there, on the damp, mossy bank, she found them, a small, brave cluster of wild daisies, their white petals and yellow hearts a cheerful, unexpected splash of color against the drab browns and grays of the landscape. They were a small miracle, a sign of life persisting against the odds. She carefully picked a single perfect flower, its stem cool and fragile in her hand. By evening, the door was fixed. It was not perfect. It was a patchwork of old and new wood, and it sat a little crookedly in the frame, but it was solid. It closed. Wade had fashioned a simple wooden latch for the inside. That night, for the first time, Jessa heard the solid, definitive sound of a latch clicking into place, shutting the world out. The feeling of security it gave her was so profound it almost made her weep. They were building a life in the ruins, a fragile domesticity measured in small, silent gestures. They were a team, a partnership that existed entirely in the realm of action, not words. The next morning, this silent language continued. When Jessa woke, Wade was sitting at the table, cleaning his rifle. The intricate metal parts laid out on a piece of oiled leather, the morning sun, streaming through the now clean window, glinted on the steel. Jessa got up and began to prepare a simple breakfast of coffee and the last of their flour, mixed with water and cooked into a flatbread on a hot stone by the fire. They moved around each other in the small space with an easy, unconscious grace, a rhythm born of shared purpose. After they ate, Wade stood up to leave, presumably to hunt for some fresh meat. As he passed the table, he placed something on the scrubbed wooden surface. He did not look at her or say a word. He simply put it down and walked out, the newly repaired door closing with a solid thud behind him. It was a handkerchief. It was not like her own treasured, embroidered linen. This one was made of plain, sturdy cotton, a faded blue-gray color, but it was spotlessly clean, and it had been folded into a neat, precise square. It was a simple, practical object, but to Jessa, it was a poem. It was an acknowledgement. It was his way of saying that he saw her not just as a survivor, but as a woman. It was a recognition of her efforts to bring cleanliness and order to their shelter. It was a gift of dignity, a small piece of civilization in the midst of the wild. She picked it up. It smelled faintly of soap. She held the clean, folded cloth in her hands, and it felt as precious as gold. She knew she had to answer. A gift of such quiet grace demanded a response in kind. She took the small daisy she had picked the day before, which she had kept fresh in a cup of water. She found an empty tin can and filled it with water from the bucket. She placed the single, cheerful flower in the can and set it in the very center of the table. It was a small, simple thing, a single white flower in a rusty tin can. It offered no practical value. It could not be eaten or used for shelter or defense. Its only purpose was to be beautiful. It was a splash of color in a monochrome world. It was a gesture of hope, a testament to life's stubborn insistence on beauty, even in the harshest of places. It was her reply. It was her way of acknowledging the man beneath the hardened exterior, the man who had shown her a tenderness she had never believed possible. When Wade returned later that day, a brace of rabbits hanging from his belt, he stopped just inside the newly repaired door. He saw the flower on the table. His eyes rested on it for a long time. A stillness came over his face. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The plain, clean handkerchief sat on the mantelpiece where Jessa had placed it. The single, bright daisy stood on the table. There were no words exchanged, but the conversation was clear, a silent acknowledgement that passed between two lonely souls in a ruined house. I see you, and I see you. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as quiet and steady as a resting heartbeat. They were a small, two-person civilization in the heart of a dead town. They spoke little, but their silence was a language of its own, a tapestry woven from shared tasks and mutual respect. The clean cabin, the solid door, the single daisy in its tin can, these were their words. Each sunrise brought with it a sense of fragile peace, a feeling so new and strange to Jessa that she often woke with a start, convinced it had been a dream. The fear of pursuit had not vanished, but it had receded, becoming a dull, distant ache rather than a sharp, immediate terror. With each passing day of quiet survival, the walls of their small sanctuary seemed to grow stronger, the outside world more remote. Wade hunted, scouted, and reinforced their shelter with a silent, tireless competence. Jessa, in turn, transformed the dusty ruin into a home. She gathered edible roots and berries, washed their few clothes in the stream, and kept the fire, the heart of their small world, burning steadily. She was no longer a frightened refugee. She was a partner in their survival. She was becoming a person she didn't recognize, someone stronger and more capable than the girl who had stumbled into a stranger's camp just a few days. Or was it a lifetime ago? The change was most apparent in her moments of quiet observation. She would watch Wade as he worked, his large, capable hands moving with an ingrained skill, whether he was skinning a rabbit or mending a strap on his saddlebags. She saw the deep, abiding sadness in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, a shadow that the quiet peace of their days could not quite dispel. She knew, with a certainty that went beyond words, that his pain was tied to this place, to the faded bloodstain on the wall, and her heart ached for him, a feeling of empathy and a fierce, protective tenderness that was as new and startling as the peace she had found. One evening, the air was unusually still. The sun had set, leaving behind a sky of bruised purple and soft, velvety gray. A chill was creeping in, and the fire in the hearth was a welcome blaze of warmth and light. They had just finished a meal of roasted rabbit, and the comfortable silence had settled around them. Wade was staring into the flames, lost in his own thoughts, the firelight carving deep shadows on his rugged face. Jessa was mending a tear in his shirt with a needle and thread she had found in a rusted tin in his saddlebags. The simple, domestic act felt profoundly significant, another stitch in the fabric of their shared life. It started with a scent. It was not the clean, sharp smell of their own mesquite fire. It was a different kind of smoke, acrid and oily, with the bitter tang of old, dry wood burning too fast. Jessa wrinkled her nose, her needle pausing mid-stitch. It was a wrong smell, a discordant note in the quiet harmony of the evening. She glanced at Wade. He hadn't moved a muscle, but he was no longer staring into the fire. His head was cocked at a slight angle, his body utterly still, every line of it radiating a sudden, intense alertness. He was like a wolf that had scented danger on the wind. He had smelled it too, slowly. He lifted his gaze from the fire and met hers across the small room. The quiet peace in his eyes was gone, replaced by the hard, cold glint of steel she had seen during the chase. He put a single finger to his lips, a command for absolute silence. He rose from his seat without a sound, his movements as fluid and silent as a shadow. He took his rifle from where it leaned against the wall, checking the action with a soft, metallic click that was deafening in the sudden, tense silence. He moved to the single, clean window, staying to one side, out of the direct line of sight, and peered cautiously into the twilight. Jessa's blood ran cold, the fragile peace shattered, the sanctuary violated. They had been found. The distant, aching fear was suddenly a sharp, screaming reality. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Wade stepped back from the window, his face a grim, stony mask. "Smoke," he said, his voice a low, barely audible rumble, from the old livery stable. The livery stable was at the other end of the dead town's main street, a good distance away, but there was no reason for it to be burning, not unless someone had set it on fire. It was a signal, or a diversion, or, worst of all, an act of pure, malicious intent, an attempt to smoke them out like rats from a hole. Panic, the old, familiar enemy, clawed at Jessa's throat. Her first instinct was to run, to hide, to find the darkest corner of the cabin and pray for invisibility. But then she looked at Wade. He was not panicked. He was calm, focused, his mind already working, calculating, planning. His calmness was a lifeline, and she clung to it. He crossed the room to her, his steps silent on the swept floor. He knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. His hands were warm and steady, a stark contrast to her own, which were icy cold and trembling. "Listen to me." "Jessa," he said, his voice low and urgent, his slate-gray eyes boring into hers. "There's no time for fear. Hatcher's found us, or someone has. It makes no difference." He was giving her a command, But it was also a gift. He was telling her she was strong enough to master her fear. She took a deep, shaky breath and nodded, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "There's a rock face south of here," he continued, speaking quickly, his words precise and clear. "About a mile. It overlooks the canyon we came through. You see the 3 jagged peaks that look like a wolf's teeth?" She had noticed them. They were a landmark, stark against the sky. She nodded again. "Go there," he said. "Get to the highest point you can, find cover, and wait. Don't light a fire, don't make a sound. If I'm not there by sunrise, you keep going north. You follow the canyon until it opens up into the plains. Don't stop. Do you understand me?" It was an escape plan, a plan for her, not for them. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He was going to stay. He was going to face them alone. He was sending her away, back out into the wilderness, back to being a solitary, hunted creature. "What about you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "I'm going to buy you time." He was going to die. That was what he meant. He was going to stand against Hatcher and his men, however many there were, to give her a chance to escape. He was sacrificing himself for her, a girl he had known for only a handful of days. And in that moment, Jessa knew she would not, could not, do it. The girl who had stumbled out of the desert, weak and terrified, would have run. She would have taken the chance he was offering and fled without a backward glance. Her own survival the only thing that mattered, but she was not that girl anymore. In this small, ruined cabin, she had found something more than just a temporary sanctuary. She had found a piece of her own soul she thought had been lost forever. She had found the strength to trust, the courage to connect, and the capacity to care for another human being. To run now would be to abandon all of that. It would be to betray not only him, but the new person she had become. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid and unmovable as the stone walls of the canyon. Wade stared at her, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Jessa, this is not a discussion. They are here for you. If you are gone, they have no reason to stay." "You don't know that," she countered, her voice gaining strength. "You don't know men like Hatcher. They won't leave until they've burned everything to the ground and shot anything that moves. They'll hunt you for sport. No, I'm not leaving you." "You are not a fighter," he said, his voice hard, laced with a desperate frustration. "You will only get in the way. You will get us both killed." His words were meant to be cruel, to frighten her into obedience. But they had the opposite effect. They ignited a spark of defiance in her, a hot, bright flame of anger. "And what are you?" she shot back, her hands balling into fists. "Are you a god? Can you face 3, 4, 5 men with just one rifle? I am not leaving. I have been running my whole life. Wade, I am tired of running." She pulled her hands from his and stood up, turning her back on him. Her mind was racing. He was right about one thing. She was not a fighter. She had no skill with a gun, but she was not helpless. Not anymore. While he had been teaching her how to survive in the wilderness, she had been learning other lessons on her own. She had watched him, studied his preparedness, his constant vigilance, and she had adopted a piece of it for herself. The day before, while sharpening the small, sturdy knife she used to skin vegetables and clean their rabbits, an idea had come to her. It was a wild, desperate thought, but it had felt right. She had taken the freshly sharpened knife, its blade only a few inches long but wickedly sharp, and had slipped it into her right boot, nestling it against her ankle. It was a secret, a last resort, a small piece of power that belonged only to her. She looked around the small room they had made their own, the clean table, the swept floor, the single daisy, now slightly wilted, still in its tin can. This was her home. She had fought for it, not with guns, but with a broom and a rag and a stubborn refusal to give in to despair. And she would fight for it now. Wade had risen to his feet behind her. She could feel his presence, his frustration and his fear, a palpable thing in the small space. "Jessa, for God's sake, be reasonable." She turned to face him, her eyes blazing. "Reasonable? Was it reasonable for you to stop for me in the desert? Was it reasonable for you to face down Hatcher's men to save a girl you didn't even know? You taught me that sometimes. You don't run. Sometimes you stand your ground. Well, I'm standing." She took a deep breath, her decision hardening into a core of unshakable resolve. "This is the first time in my life I've had someone worth fighting for. The first time I haven't been alone, and I will not run and be alone again." She bent down, and before he could react, she lifted the hem of her dress just enough to reveal the handle of the knife tucked into her boot. She pulled it out. The small blade gleamed in the firelight, a deadly little sliver of steel. "I know how to use this," she said, her voice low and steady. "I'm not as helpless as you think." He stared at the knife, then at her face. He saw the fierce, unyielding determination in her eyes. He saw that she was not the same frightened girl he had found on the road. She was a woman, forged in the fires of fear and desperation, and she had made her choice. To argue further would be to waste the precious few seconds they had left. A look of grim, reluctant acceptance settled over his features. He had offered her a chance at life, and she had chosen to stand with him in the shadow of death. A part of him was furious at her stubbornness, but another, deeper part, a part he had thought long dead, felt a surge of fierce, breathtaking pride. A man's voice, rough and mocking, drifted from the direction of the burning stable. "Come on out, Callahan. We know you're in there, and we know you've got something that belongs to Mr. Thorne." It was Hatcher's voice. Wade moved. "All business now." He grabbed Jessa's arm, his grip firm but no longer trying to force her. He pulled her away from the window, pressing her into the corner of the room beside the hearth, the darkest part of the cabin. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Stay low, and do not move from this spot unless the roof is on fire. Do you understand?" She nodded, her hand gripping the handle of her knife so tightly her knuckles were white. He moved to the door, his rifle held at the ready. He pressed his back against the wall beside it. A silent, deadly shadow. The orange glow from the burning stable flickered through the window, casting long, dancing shadows that writhed like living things on the opposite wall. The peaceful cabin had become a trap, a fortress under siege. Jessa crouched in the corner, her back pressed against the cold stones of the hearth. The smell of smoke was stronger now, thick and suffocating. She could hear the crackle of the flames, and the muffled shouts of the men as they moved closer. Her heart was a wild, frantic thing, but her mind was strangely calm. The choice had been made. There was no going back. For the first time, she was not running from the monsters. She was waiting for them. For the first time, she was not a victim cowering in the dark. She was a woman with a blade in her hand, standing beside the only person in the world who had ever made her feel safe, and she would not let them take that from her without a fight. The silence that followed Hatcher's shout was a living, breathing thing, a predator coiling in the darkness, crouched in the corner. Jessa felt her own breath catch in her throat, her knuckles white on the handle of the small knife. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood and the metallic tang of impending violence. The fire in the hearth, once a source of comfort, now seemed to mock them, its light painting their small cabin into a perfect, inescapable target. From his position beside the door, Wade was a study in absolute stillness. He was no longer a man. He was a weapon, waiting. The long rifle in his hand seemed an extension of his own body. Jessa watched him, and in his stillness, she found a strange, terrifying calm. Her own fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was no longer a paralyzing force. It had been honed to a sharp, a fine point, a survival instinct that was as clear and cold as the blade she held in her hand. A heavy boot slammed against the newly repaired door. The wood groaned, the new latch holding firm, but the entire frame shuddered. "Don't make this hard. Callahan?" Hatcher's voice was closer now, laced with a cruel, mocking amusement. "We saw the smoke from your little love nest. Just send out the girl, and we'll let you walk away." It was a lie, and everyone knew it. Men like Hatcher didn't leave witnesses. Another slam, harder this time. A crack appeared in one of the old planks. Jessa could hear the muffled laughter of the other men, the hungry sounds of a wolf pack closing in on its prey. Wade didn't answer. He didn't waste his breath. He simply raised the rifle, aiming it not at the door, but at the wall beside it. He was anticipating, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment. The third kick was a massive, splintering blow. The door flew open, torn from its single remaining hinge, and crashed inward onto the floor. For a split second, the doorway was filled with the silhouette of a large man, a shotgun held at his hip, a wide, triumphant grin on his face in the flickering firelight. It was the last thing he ever saw. Wade fired. The roar of the rifle in the enclosed space was a physical blow, a deafening explosion of sound and force that slammed into Jessa, making her ears ring and her teeth ache. The man in the doorway was thrown backward as if struck by an invisible fist, a dark, spreading stain appearing on his chest. He disappeared from view, his triumphant grin erased forever. Chaos erupted outside. Shouts of anger and surprise replaced the mocking laughter. Another man, braver or more foolish than the rest, tried to rush the doorway. Wade worked the lever action on his rifle. The shuck-shuck of the mechanism a swift, deadly promise. He fired again. The second man screamed and fell, clutching a leg that was no longer whole. But there were more of them. While Wade was focused on the front, a new sound came from the side of the cabin, the shattering of glass that was no longer there, and the splintering of the old, dry wood of the window frame. A third man was trying to climb through the window. Wade spun, his movements a blur of lethal efficiency. He fired a third time, and the man at the window dropped out of sight. But the move had cost him. It had exposed his back to the open doorway for a fatal second. A fourth figure appeared in the doorway. It was Hatcher. He was not rushing in blindly. He was smart, his eyes cold and calculating. He held a pistol, and it was already aimed. Wade was turning back, bringing the rifle around, but he was a fraction of a second too late. Jessa saw it happen as if time itself had slowed to a thick, agonizing crawl. She saw Wade's eyes lock with Hatcher's. She saw him begin to move, not to aim, but to throw himself sideways, to place his body between Hatcher's gun and the corner where she was hiding. It was a purely instinctual act of protection. The orange flash from Hatcher's pistol was a blinding star in the smoky room. The sound was a sharp, flat crack, different from the deep roar of the rifle. Wade grunted, a sound of pained surprise, his body contorted, the rifle clattering from his grasp onto the floorboards. He staggered back a step, his hand flying to his left shoulder, where a dark, wet patch was already blossoming on his shirt. He looked down at his own wound, his expression one of grim, weary disbelief. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed, falling like a great felled tree, landing heavily on the floor, unmoving. The world went silent. The ringing in Jessa's ears faded, replaced by a roaring, rushing sound, the sound of her own blood pounding in her head. Wade was down. The wall that had stood between her and the world, the fortress that had sheltered her, had fallen. Hatcher stepped into the room over the body of his fallen man, the pistol still smoking in his hand. His cold eyes swept the room, and then they found her. They found Jessa, crouched in the corner, a small, frozen thing in the flickering shadows. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He had won. The prize was his. "Well now," he said, his voice a low, gloating purr. "Look what we have here. The little runaway bird, Mr. Thorne is going to be so pleased to have you back, though we might have a little fun on the long ride home." He took a step toward her, and in that moment, the fear in Jessa's heart died. burned away by a sudden, incandescent rage. It was a fury so pure and so absolute it was like a physical fire in her veins. This man had hurt Wade. He had taken down the one person in the world who had shown her kindness, who had made her feel safe. He had destroyed their home, their peace. And now he was coming for her, his eyes full of a filthy, possessive light. He would not have her. He would not win. As Hatcher took another step, his attention focused on his prize. His guard lowered. Jessa moved. She did not scream. She did not cower. She launched herself from the corner like a cornered wildcat, a silent, furious blur of motion. He was surprised by the suddenness of her attack. He grunted as her small body slammed into his, the impact knocking him off balance. He was bigger, stronger, but her rage gave her a strength she had never known she possessed. Her left hand clawed at his face, her nails digging for his eyes. Her right hand, holding the small, sharp knife, came up in a desperate, vicious arc. The knife she had once considered using to cut her own hair, an act of self-erasure, of making herself less visible, had become a part of her. It was no longer a tool of despair, but an instrument of pure, savage defiance. He grabbed her wrist, his fingers like a band of steel, stopping the knife just inches from his throat. He was immensely strong. He twisted her arm, a pained cry escaping her lips as a sharp, fiery agony shot up to her shoulder. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Feisty, ain't ya?" They struggled, a desperate, clumsy, intimate dance of violence in the middle of the blood-strewn room. Jessa fought with a ferocity that came from a place beyond reason. She kicked, she bit, she twisted, trying to break his grip. He was toying with her, his superior strength making it a game. He forced her arm back, further and further, the pressure on her wrist becoming unbearable. The knife was her only hope, and he was about to take it from her. But he had made a mistake. He was so focused on the knife, on subduing her, that he had forgotten his other hand, the one holding the pistol. In the struggle, his grip on the gun had loosened. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Jessa slammed her head forward, catching him square on the bridge of his nose. There was a satisfying crunch of bone and cartilage. He howled in pain and surprise, his head snapping back. For a split second, his grip on her wrist loosened. It was all she needed. She did not try to stab him again. She changed her target, with a guttural cry that was torn from the very depths of her soul. She drove the point of the knife down, hard, into the top of his thigh. It was a place she could reach, a place of thick muscle, but also a place of life, of the great artery she knew from skinning rabbits was hidden there. The blade sank into the hilt. Hatcher screamed. It was not a sound of anger or triumph, but a high, thin, animal sound of pure, unadulterated agony. His grip on her vanished. He looked down at the handle of the knife protruding from his leg in stunned disbelief. A dark, pulsing fountain of blood began to gush from the wound, soaking his trousers in seconds. He staggered back, his face a mask of shock and horror. He looked at Jessa, his cold eyes wide with a dawning terror. He had been beaten. He had been brought down by the little runaway bird. He opened his mouth to say something, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. His legs gave way, and he collapsed onto the floor, landing in a heap near the hearth, his hands clutching desperately at the gushing wound. The room was suddenly, shockingly silent. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the ragged, desperate gasps of Jessa's own breathing. She stood in the center of the room, her whole body trembling violently, an uncontrollable ague of shock and adrenaline. Her right hand was sticky and warm, covered in Hatcher's blood. She looked at her own hand as if it belonged to someone else. She had done that. She had taken a man's life. The thought did not bring her triumph. It did not bring her satisfaction. It brought only a cold, hollowing wave of nausea and horror. But there was no time for that. Her eyes flew to the place where Wade had fallen. He was still there, a dark, motionless heap on the floor. "Wade," she whispered. There was no answer. A new kind of terror, colder and sharper than any she had ever known, pierced through her shock. She stumbled toward him, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. She fell to her knees at his side. His face was pale, his eyes closed. The dark stain on his shoulder had grown, soaking the fabric of his shirt. His chest was still, too still. "No," she breathed, the word, a prayer. "No, no, no." She put her trembling, blood-stained hand on his chest, desperate to feel the rise and fall of his breath, the beat of his heart. Nothing. "Wade, please," she begged, her voice breaking, tears blurring her vision, tracing clean paths through the grime and blood on her cheeks. "Please don't be dead. Please don't leave me." Panic gave way to a desperate, wrenching grief. He was gone. The one good, decent thing in her life, the one person who had seen her, had protected her, was gone. And it was her fault. If she had just run as he'd told her to, he would still be alive. "Don't die," she sobbed, her words a torrent of grief and regret, her forehead resting on his still chest. "Please, don't die. I haven't finished telling you." What hadn't she told him? She hadn't told him his name was the first name she had learned to associate with safety. She hadn't told him that the simple gesture of a clean handkerchief had meant more to her than a sack of gold. She hadn't told him that in the ruins of his past, he had given her a future. She hadn't told him that he had taught her how to be brave. A faint pressure. It was so slight she thought she had imagined it. A weak, trembling pressure on her own bloody hand, the one that rested on his chest. Her head snapped up. His eyes were open. They were clouded with pain, unfocused, but they were open, and they were looking at her. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He tried again, a faint, rasping sound escaping his throat. His other hand, his good hand, moved with excruciating slowness, inching its way across his chest until his fingers, weak and trembling, found hers. He wrapped them around her hand, his grip barely there, a ghost of his former strength. He took a shallow, rattling breath, and then he spoke. His voice was a faint, ragged whisper, barely audible above the crackling of the fire, but she heard it. She heard every word, and they sank into her soul, a warm and living anchor in a cold, spinning world of death and fear. "I'm still here." His words were a lifeline, a flickering candle in a world that had gone dark and cold. "I'm still here." Jessa clung to them, clung to his weak grasp, as the adrenaline and rage drained out of her, leaving behind a trembling, hollow shell. The night was a blur of frantic, desperate action, fueled by a terror that was sharper and more profound than any fear she had felt for her own life, the fear of losing him. She managed to drag him away from the open doorway, away from the dead men who lay like discarded puppets in the moonlight. Her own strength surprised her. It was the strength of pure, undiluted will. She tore strips from the hem of her dress, her hands clumsy and slick with his blood, and packed the wound in his shoulder, trying to staunch the bleeding as she had once seen a ranch hand do for a gored horse. She had no idea if she was doing it right. She worked by raw instinct, her mind a frantic prayer. "Don't die. Don't leave me. I'm still here, too." The rest of the night was a grim, necessary horror. She had to secure their shelter. She couldn't leave the bodies where they lay, with a strength born of revulsion and necessity. She dragged the men out of the cabin, one by one, leaving them in the cold, uncaring moonlight of the main street, far from their door. The last one was Hatcher. His eyes were open, staring up at the stars with a look of slack-jawed surprise. She did not look at his face. She couldn't. She scrubbed the floor of the cabin for the second time. But this time, she was not washing away the dust of old sorrows. She was washing away fresh blood, her own small victory and his near-fatal sacrifice. When she was done, The floor was clean, the door was barred, and a fresh fire was crackling in the hearth. Wade lay on a makeshift bed of his saddle blanket and her borrowed coat, his breathing shallow and ragged, his face pale as ash. She sat by his side all night, bathing his feverish head with cool water, her hand never leaving his, a silent, sleepless vigil. The days that followed were a crucible. Wade hovered in a twilight world of fever and pain, sometimes lucid, more often lost in a delirious landscape of past battles and forgotten sorrows. In those moments, he would murmur a name. Eli. His voice filled with a pain so raw it made Jessa's own heart ache. She learned to be a nurse, a guardian, a hunter. She learned to clean his wound, to force broth between his lips, to sit for hours, simply holding his hand, anchoring him to the living world. The roles were reversed. She was the strong one now, the protector, and the responsibility settled on her not as a burden, but as a privilege. Caring for him was the most meaningful work she had ever done. Slowly, agonizingly, he began to heal. The fever broke one evening, leaving him weak and drenched in sweat, but his eyes were clear for the first time in days. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the exhaustion etched on her face, the fierce, protective light in her eyes. He tried to speak, but she placed a finger on his lips. "Rest," she whispered. "I'm here." It was all that needed to be said. Weeks passed. The harsh, unforgiving landscape outside their small cabin began to soften with the subtle signs of a changing season. The memory of the violent night faded, becoming a part of the cabin's history, a story absorbed by its old, silent logs. The ghost of Wade's brother was no longer the sole occupant of their home. It was joined by the ghosts of the men who had come to harm them, and the ghost of the girl Jessa used to be. The space was no longer haunted by his past alone. It was hallowed by theirs. As Wade's strength returned, a new, gentle rhythm of life took root. He was still weak, his arm in a sling she had fashioned from a strip of canvas, but he could not be idle. He began to work on the small, broken-down fence that had once enclosed the cabin's yard. He moved slowly, his actions deliberate, but there was a new purpose in his work. He was not just mending a fence, he was building a boundary, a perimeter of safety around their world. He was claiming this place, not as a temporary refuge, but as a home. Jessa, in turn, found a small, protected patch of earth behind the cabin, where the little stream kept the soil dark and moist. She found a spade with a broken handle in the old blacksmith's shop and began to turn the earth. She planted the seeds she had found in Wade's saddlebags, a small, precious pouch of beans and corn. She was planting a future. The simple, hopeful act of putting a seed in the ground was an act of faith, a declaration that they would be here to see it grow. They worked in a comfortable, easy silence, each taking strength from the other's presence. Sometimes, she would bring him a cup of water as he worked on the fence, and their fingers would brush as he took it from her. The small touch was a spark of quiet electricity, a wordless conversation. Sometimes, he would come to watch her in the garden, and he would simply stand there, his good shoulder leaning against a post, a small, gentle smile touching his lips as he watched her work. The hard, stony mask was gone, replaced by a quiet, open tenderness that made her own heart feel full to bursting. One late afternoon, the sun was a warm, golden honey pouring over the valley. The sky was a vast, cloudless blue. Jessa had finished her work in the garden. She stood, brushing the rich, dark soil from her hands, and looked over at Wade. He was fitting a new post into the fence line, his movements slow but sure. He was absorbed in his work, the setting sun catching the lines of concentration on his face. A wave of feeling so powerful it almost stole her breath washed over her. It was a complex and beautiful thing, a mixture of gratitude, affection, and a deep, profound sense of peace. This man, this quiet, wounded man, had saved her life. But he had done more than that. He had given her a life worth saving. He had given her a home, not just in this small cabin, but within herself. She walked over to him. He didn't hear her approach until she was standing right beside him. He looked up, his slate-gray eyes questioning. She looked at his face, at the new, fine scar that ran along his jaw from a splintered piece of wood during the fight, at the weariness that still lingered in the corners of his eyes, and at the quiet strength that was the very core of him. She reached out and placed her hand on his good shoulder, the one that had not been shattered by Hatcher's bullet. The muscle was hard and warm beneath her palm. "I'm not running anymore," she said. Her voice was soft, but it held the unwavering conviction of a vow. He stopped his work, turning to face her fully. He looked deep into her eyes, searching, and he saw the truth of her words there. He saw that the haunted, hunted look was gone, replaced by a calm, steady light. She was home. "I have nothing to run from," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "And nowhere I'd rather be. Everything I want is right here." A slow smile touched his lips. It was a real smile, one that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners and filling them with a warm, gentle light. It transformed his rugged face, making him look younger, less burdened. "And you said," he began, his voice a low, gentle rumble. This was a first. He was quoting her own words back to her, the words she had spoken in this very yard, in this very spot. It seemed a lifetime ago, the words of a broken, trusting girl. But he was not mocking her. He was reminding her. He was acknowledging the journey they had taken, the impossible distance they had traveled from that first, fragile confession to this moment of quiet, solid truth. A single, happy tear traced a path down her cheek. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump of emotion in her throat. "Yes," she finally managed to whisper. "A first." He lifted his good hand, the one that was not in the sling. He gently brushed the tear from her cheek with his thumb. Then, just as he had done in the dusty cabin, he tenderly cupped her face, his calloused palm warm against her skin. He leaned in, and his gaze was full of a reverence and a promise that made her heart soar. He did not kiss her lips. He lowered his head and pressed a gentle, lingering kiss to her forehead. It was not a kiss of passion, but of deep, abiding affection. It was a kiss of acceptance, of homecoming. It was a seal, a blessing. "Then it'll be worth remembering," he said, his voice a low, soft murmur against her skin. He let his hand fall, and a comfortable, perfect silence settled between them. The sun was dipping below the distant hills now, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The air grew cool. The day's work was done. Without a word, he turned and began to walk toward the cabin. Jessa fell into step beside him. They walked side by side, their shoulders occasionally brushing, two solitary figures moving as one through the deepening twilight. They reached the door, the solid, repaired door that had held against the storm, and Wade pushed it open. The warm, welcoming glow from the fire she had banked that morning spilled out to greet them. They stepped inside, into the home they had built from the ashes of the past. He closed the door, and the solid click of the wooden latch shutting them in, safe from the world, was the only sound. They did not speak. They didn't need to. This silence was not empty. It was full of everything that mattered. It was a promise of shared sunrises, of quiet work, of a future built not on running away, but on staying. It was the first of 1,000 peaceful nights to come. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let us know, and feel free to share your thoughts with our community. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and support us further by hitting the hype button so more people can hear this story.